Um, Shit. Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People's Podcast by JPPI. It's great to be back with everyone for a new week and ahead of the Shavuot holiday. Obviously, the big news of the last few days is the miraculous almost rescue of four Israeli hostages on Shabbat, on Saturday, inside Nusirat, a refugee camp in the central Gaza Strip. So many aspects of the story, which we're going to talk about today with Gil Troy, Professor Gil Troy, uh, another fellow, senior fellow at JPPI, before we get to an interview that I did with the heads of Prisma, Amy Adler, who is the senior director at Prisma for catalyzing resources, as well as Deborah Schaefer-Seaman, who's the director of network weaving. As I said to you all on Thursday, we were going to be doing a two-part deep dive into Jewish education in North America. But because of the news of the weekend, we've decided to proceed that conversation with Amy and Deborah, which I strongly recommend listening to. Very interesting in terms of the allocation of resources, enrollment, tuition, stipends, and the likes, as well as content for schools, and how schools are treating educators and helping them cope with a post-October 7th reality. But before all of that, I want to bring up two aspects of the rescue, of course, of the hostages, and then loop in Gil into the conversation. And Gil, feel free to join us. But the two aspects that I want to touch on, I think, really say to some extent or tell the story of Israel to a large extent of what is possible for this country. And on the one hand, you have this amazing daytime operation in Nusirat, four hostages, two locations, apartments that are in people's homes. The ability to get to these places discreetly and covertly, to be able to rescue them. And of course, the moment that you breach those homes, you're letting the Hamas terrorists and gunmen and everyone else know that you are there. And then there's a fight to escape and escape safely and securely. There's also the story, to an extent, of Arnon Zmora, who was the Yamam commander, Special Forces, who breached the apartment where the three men, Andrei, Shlomi, and Almog, were being kept, and was critically wounded and killed. And I was thinking about how, now the name of the operation has been changed to Operation Arnon, as opposed to a different name that it had before. But how we never would have known who this person is. We never would have had his name. We never would have seen his photo. We never would have looked at this beautiful family, his wife and his two sons. We would have walked past him on the street, and we wouldn't have known that there is literally a giant walking among us. And it's something that I think we often take very much for granted in the world in general. Definitely, I feel that I probably have taken it for granted when thinking about the operations of this kind, going back and thinking of the rescue also that was conducted by Imam in Rafah, where they saved and rescued two hostages a couple months ago. These are people who we don't know who they are. They move in the shadows. And as his widow now, Michal, I think was her name, wrote to people in a post on Facebook and said, I know that he's a hero, and I know that, you'll remember him for the operation, but he was also the greatest spouse and the greatest father and a loving and kind man. And it just really, I think, humanizes to an extent and gives us the face of the people who are doing things that are incredible and unbelievable, and are literally saving lives and laying down their own to make that possible. The other aspect, and Gil, here, I'll throw this one at you, was how the world has responded to this operation. And I mean, my mind has been blown, I have to say, has been blown. Like, from Saturday night, let's say Shabbat, where I log online. And obviously, I'm sure like many, like most, you knew about this operation, even though it was Shabbat. I heard about it on Shabbat. I heard about it earlier, but then I went for a late afternoon walk, and I'm walking down the train tracks in our neighborhood, right? Gil and I live not far from one another. And I have people who I'm walking up, Yaakov, did you hear the news? Yaakov, did you hear the news? And then later you're seeing all these pictures of people from different neighborhoods around the country where people had put up on lampposts and at the entrance to apartment buildings to our neighbors who are Shomer Shabbat. Right? This is what happened on Shabbat, just in case you didn't hear. Like there was this outpouring of a celebration for this country because so desperately needed it. But when you see people like Joseph Borrell, the High Representative of the European Union Foreign Envoy, whatever his title is, the Foreign Minister of the EU, who says in one tweet, I share relief at the rescue of the hostages. And then in the next tweet, Israel has again conducted a massacre. And I mean, I was on BBC yesterday being interviewed about this and getting questions the likes of, well, why couldn't Israel have warned the people before they go into Gaza? And how come so many people had to be killed and die in this rescue operation? I mean, Gil, break this down for me. What the hell is wrong with people? What's going on?
First, I'll see you and raise you. I'm reading the tweet of Francesca Albanese, who wrote, relieved that 4 hostages have been released. Released,
right.
And of course, we have the broader notion of, all Gazans being innocent. Now, we have repeatedly said in this podcast that we take no joy in true innocents being killed and how difficult this war is, but how difficult it is when Hamas hides behind these civilians. And let's also go to the fact that Noah Argamani was a hostage who's being held, it seems to be, in the apartment of a reporter for Al Jazeera, and a reporter who also written for various other websites. And he's also counted not only as an innocent civilian, but as now a martyr journalist. So you do see 2 things. One is you see this split screen view of this particular war, that every time we tell a story focusing on October 7th, focusing on the ongoing evil of the kidnappings, the ongoing evil of the mass murders, the ongoing evil of the fact that every single action since October 7th, every single death, every single innocent Palestinian killed is ultimately on Hamas's, should be on Hamas's conscience if they had a conscience. It's their fault. And those are the rules of war going back for centuries, as you well know. And those are the rules of war as articulated by people like Michael Walzer. And those are the rules of war that the United States has followed in World War II, in the Civil War, certainly, and more recently in Iraq and Afghanistan. So one is we have this split screen view about what's happening day to day, but it goes so much deeper, which is one really feels that the Jewish state is now being graded on a completely different curve. And that there really is what, Natan Sharansky has been talking for years about when we talk about true anti-Semitism, the double standards, the demonization, the disproportionate reaction. And again, we as historians, you as a military expert, can point to how America does things, how the UK does things. And I never compare Israel to Syria, Hamas, Yemen. I compare Israel to the wonderful club it's part of called liberal Western democracies. And even by those standards, Israel's held to an unbelievably high standard, a standard by which you cannot defend yourself. And language matters. So yes, when you call this remarkable, heroic rescue a release, you're perpetuating a notion that these people are just, happily enjoying a 250-day vacation, being hosted by these lovely Al Jazeera reporters. It is the big lie. And I'm now calling this total anti-Semitism, total Jew hatred. It used to be that we called it the longest hatred because it's so old. I added that it's the most plastic hatred because it keeps on taking on different forms, but it's also the most total hatred because they try to rob us not only of our dignity, not only of our lives, but of our story. It's the equivalent of saying to African Americans, oh, there was no such thing as black slavery. They say there's no such thing as your ties to this land. There's no such thing as October 7th. And if it did happen, you deserved it. It is total and totalitarian.
2 things that I'm thinking about. The obviously, hostages released. So I was asked in one interview, why did there have to be so much fighting? Why did it have to be so aggressive? And I couldn't understand the question. right? Because it just seems so like, what do you think happens? I said, do you think you just show up, you knock on the door, and you say, "Hi, I'm from the Israeli military. Can I please have Noah back? Can I please have Almog and Shlomi and Andre? Can they come home now?" I mean, what reality do you live in that you think that this is some Hollywood movie, or that you think it's we're playing nice with our neighbors? These are people who broke into our country, stole these people, raped, burned, murdered along the way, have kept people for 8 months. If you give notice ahead of time, which by the way, we've done, that's the crazy thing, Gil, and it ties into what you're saying. We've gotten the world used to a form of warfare that is so above and beyond what is done on the battlefield that when we don't do that because it doesn't make sense, it would go against the mission. They want to know, why aren't you doing that? So when we dropped leaflets before we went into northern Gaza, or when we gave months notice before going into Rafah and had 1 million people vacate the Rafah area in the span of 2 weeks, when the Americans, the British, and the Europeans were telling us it would take 5 months, right? So the world says, how come you don't do that in Nusirat? Because then they would kill the hostages, or they would move them somewhere else, as they've done frequently and numerous times throughout the last 8 months. So you really have to be just a complete idiot, I'm sorry, to even talk that way. But I really do think in this war has been a huge wake-up call for me, because it made, and I'm probably biased, but as a longtime journalist, over almost 2.5 decades now in the business,
Despite your youth.
yes, thank you. But I've always wanted to believe, yeah, there's ignorance, and there's of course bias, and there is some anti-Semitism, but it's also about how we do and how we tell our story, and we could always do better. That was always, whenever I would hear they're anti-Semites, I would say, yeah, but we could do better, and we could try better, and this war has just thrown that out the window, because there is no other explanation for what you were just describing.
This weekend, let's just add
Yeah.
that as soon as the Israeli soldiers came in on this holy mission, what happened? Everybody pulled out their RPG. Everybody pulled out their automatic weapon. All these people who were supposedly civilians were remarkably armed. How is it that street scene, which, by the way, we're also told that there's no more streets left, there's no more apartment buildings left, that Gaza has been turned into a parking lot, and yet it looked like, and even the way some of the reporters have written about it is kind of like this romantic scene where everybody was going to the market, and then all of a sudden these evil Israelis came in, but they skipped the fact that then everybody went in and pulled out their submachine gun. This is not some kind of happy-dappy romantic Hollywood stage.
No. One commander who I heard from described it as, Black Hawk Down, right?
Yeah.
Like that scene, that scenario,
right?
Or the scene that actually did happen, when the truck that was escaping with the 3 men broke down, and they were surrounded by armed Hamas fighters with RPGs, with anti-tank missiles, with AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifles. This could have been a lynch of proportions that we thankfully have not seen in a long time, of a group of people. And Israel, of course, had to fight back. So this whole notion is, of course, absurd. But I want to shift gears from.
Sorry, if I can just go.
Yeah.
So it's not useful idiots, as the communists call them. These are evil idiots.
Yeah.
There really is. There's a level of evil and there's a level of unfairness which is here. But I think the other thing we need to think about is, I've given up on Francesca Albanese, but I'm worrying about Americans. I'm worrying about Americans who, in the 1970s, 80% of the Congress had served in the army, and only now 20% of the Congress has served in the army. I'm worrying about Americans who are decent, who continue to support Israel, who just don't understand what warfare is like. And I'm saying that as an American historian, fearing that the next time America has to defend itself, they won't be prepared, because they've gotten distorted by this media bias that is basically saying the only way to fight a war is to press a button and free the hostages whenever you can. And this notion that somehow Bibi Netanyahu on down didn't want to free the hostages was actually disproved by the fact that we sacrificed one of our holiest soldiers. Arnon Zamora, Zichrono Levracham, his name may be a blessing. And that's how important it was to all of us.
Right.
I've certainly criticized Netanyahu on some things, but certainly not on this one.
Netanyahu definitely gets his share of criticism on this show. I do want to shift gears for a moment and talk about what happens now, because, and there's a number of factors here, so I'm going to just lay them out I'll set the table for a moment. Number one is, as I'm sure everyone has noticed, Benny Gantz has now resigned and stepped down from the government. He was supposed to do that, by the way, Saturday night. Of course, he held back and postponed the announcement to Sunday night after the rescue operation that took place on Saturday morning, but he's no longer in the government. Now, what you do have, though, is a question, what's next? Because I could see the members who remain in this coalition, particularly within the security cabinet, members of Likud, the Ben Gvir party and the Smotrich party, saying, oh, this is the way to do it. Yes, there's still 120 or just under hostages in Gaza. About half of them probably, it seems, are assessed no longer to be alive, but you have a number that are alive, a significant number. How do you get them back? Should we continue with this type of tactic of trying to launch these rescue operations? They don't always work, maybe. They're difficult, they're complicated. This one took weeks in the planning and they're preparing for them and training. Or do we strive to reach a deal? And I think that the hostage families, their big concern right now is exactly how is the government going to answer that question? So what do you think, Gil, is going to happen?
I think it's very important that we change the word the hostage families to some hostage families. The hostage families have done a number on us and have convinced us that a certain group of hostage families speak for all of them. But there are actually divisions within the hostage family.
This is true. I take that, yeah.
And this is not just you. This is the way the language has gone. They've done a very, very clever job of saying there's one group who wants a deal, but there are other voices. And look, no one wants to judge a hostage family. It's just incredibly painful. And even when you talk about how the operation took weeks in the planning, everybody knew that every day is agony. Every day is more torture. Every day is potentially a greater case of Stockholm syndrome, let alone rape, torture, who knows what else. So this is such a painful subject, and no one wants to judge the hostage families. But it is some hostage families are pushing for a deal. Other hostage families, like the bulk of Israeli society, believed that after the 105 were released, in a miracle, and we have to acknowledge the diplomats who did that very effectively, when 18 women were not released, there was a feeling among many people, myself included, that Hamas has come to the end of its limits and is not really going to release anymore, and they're just playing us. So every one of us who would love to see the hostages released 239 days ago is struggling with ugly realities, and each one of us balances ugly realities in different ways. So yes, this success, and we have to point out that it's really a drop in the bucket because we talk about 253 hostages who were taken evilly, perversely on October 7th. There have been, 7 rescued hostages effectively. So the numbers are very, very small. But the question is, what can you do? What are the alternatives? And I think the Biden administration is certainly feeling that Biden's speech of just a week ago, everything's so much happens that people forget, is now going to be forgotten both by Hamas, which, by the way, has an order to kill anytime a hostage is potentially about to be rescued, also putting everything in perspective. And indeed, with its shift in the government, there is a feeling that it's going to be more war and less jaw, as Winston Churchill used to say. But the bigger issue is this: where is Israeli society heading? And having not criticized Netanyahu on the operation, I do have to say that this was an opportunity, a gift to him to speak to the Israeli people. I know he's so anxious to speak to the Congress. That's not his job. His main job is speaking to the Israeli people, and this was a moment to do an assessment of the war. We have achieved A, B, C. We have failed. He has to start saying we have failed with D, E, F, and now we're going to go forward with the G, H, I. And the inability of our leader to consistently speak to us in a complicated, textured way, and instead to just play the left-right game or speak only in English to American audiences is an ongoing failure of public leadership. It's the opposite of Churchillian leadership, and it's something that now, this week, he could still correct. Gantz gave him a gift. Gantz has basically given him an opportunity to say, okay, we're sorry that he left. I'm going to be statesmanlike. I'm going to thank him. And now let's think about going forward. I see from your smirk, these are not predictions.
No, but I will say, I appreciate that, but I will say something in this, just in the last topic that I want us to touch on is the political ramifications of what Gantz did. My prediction would be, for what it's worth, that when we see polls at the end of the week, because they usually come out towards the weekend, Bibi Netanyahu Likud will have gone up. Benny Gantz will have obviously gone down quite significantly, probably. But things will start to balance out. And I think that anyhow was the trajectory. And that's why Benny Gantz understood that he needed to get out of the government because he was starting to bleed votes already. But I think that Israeli politicians and the parties that until now have said that they would not sit with Netanyahu. And that includes Lapid and Lieberman and Naftali Bennett, for that matter, who's now on the outside, who might come back in, and Benny Gantz, who did go in with Netanyahu twice already, and first time during Corona, was stabbed in the back. Now he's decided to quit the government, came in only for the brief period of these 8 months of the beginning of the war. But the question they have to ask themselves is, do we continue to disqualify Netanyahu? Or do we also rise up and become statesmen? And I think it's on... Trust me, I have so much criticism of Netanyahu, I could fill 10 podcasts about it, right? And I think a long time ago he needed to go. But he's not going, and he's climbing in the polls. And there's a very good chance that if elections are held tomorrow or in a couple of months, he will win. And I've said that from the beginning of this war. I think when people were writing him off, they wrote him off way too prematurely, way too soon. So the question we really have to ask ourselves, and this is a hard one, especially for people who think that he is a terrible prime minister and has led Israel to a great disaster, which he has. He's responsible ultimately for October 7th. But in the day after, we have to ask ourselves also, does this disqualification serve the interests of the state of Israel? Look at the government that we have now. This is not a government that is leading us in a positive direction. Now, Bibi will tell you, but it's because you guys disqualify me. Sit with me. I'll be happy to do it. They don't want to sit with him. So I don't know who's going to give in here. But at the end of the day, we have a country that's in the middle.
It's even more complicated because, as I've said before, I think that having elections right now would basically put the electoral power in the hands of Hezbollah and Hamas. They would determine when to shoot, when not to shoot, based on their reading of the polls. We also would worry about people collecting in 10s, 20s, 50s, and 100s on election day. And so it's really a hard time to have an election. I actually completely agree with you. First of all, I think we should give Benny Gantz credit for having gone in after October 7th. I think it was very noble on his part, especially having been burned by Netanyahu before. And for a couple of months, it really did not just give an illusion of unity, but it enhanced a sense of unity in the country. And I was critical of Lapid for not going in. I actually think that right now, because the Knesset has recently come together to sit, and by the way, we also have a whole other sidebar to focus on, which is what's going on with the Haredi, the ultra-Orthodox question, and whether there are growing tensions within the Likud. I think this is an opportunity to say, you know what? Let's talk about a 6-month, 9-month national unity government. This is what Menachem Begin did in 1967. He saw, for all his frustrations with the Labor Party at the time and how many times he had been disrespected, how many times he had been demonized, how many times he had been called fascist, it didn't matter, because whatever enmity we have between us, the greater enemy are those who are threatening to kill us. We have a very complicated situation in the North. We have an ongoing dilemma in the South. We have increasing strains with the Americans. We have this horrible nightmare of the hostages. If we could get an 80-person coalition, and yes, also change the narrative where it's not about Bibi Netanyahu being held hostage by Ben Gvir and Smotrich, we might have a chance to get the best heads, the best minds in Israel around the table thinking ahead. And I certainly think that's the kind of thing that we, as a kind of centrist think tank about the Jewish People Policy Institute, should be pushing, because the Jewish people need this, the Israeli people need this, but also the Western civilization needs this. Western civilization needs to see, especially as Biden-Trump continues to become a growing polarizing issue, that certain times you put aside your partisan frustration, your disgust with the other side, and you work together, because we have greater enemies, and they are enemies, and they are evil. And this really is a fight for good and evil.
On that note, Gil Troy, JPPI fellow, historian, professor, thank you so much for joining this week and today's episode. I'm going to move on to the interview that I did a couple days ago with Deborah and Amy from Prisma. Prisma is an organization that works to basically works together with all of the Jewish day schools across North America to provide them also with ideas of enrollment, how to increase enrollment, funding, and tips about curriculum and how to deal with students and educators. Very interesting. This is the second part of our deep dive into the challenges of Jewish education in North America post-October 7th. Here we go. Deborah and Amy, it's great to have you on the JPPI podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yaakov, it's a privilege.
Thank you. So both of you work for Prisma. Deborah, why don't we start with you and just tell us what is Prisma for those who might not know, like myself, until reading about it recently.
Sure, with pleasure. Prisma Center for Jewish Day Schools is the network for Jewish day schools. We partner with day schools, yeshivas, philanthropists, and communities from all Jewish denominations, helping them really to reach and impact and tackle the challenges on their paths to success. We essentially see what's possible for Jewish day schools and work together with their leaders to make that vision into a reality. At the end of the day, our vision is a vibrant, passionate, knowledgeable, and committed Jewish community empowered by Jewish day schools for generations to come.
And Jewish day schools are obviously super important because they are what creates that Jewish identity for these kids as they grow up and wanting them to be proud Jews. Do we have an idea in the US of how many Jewish kids are going to Jewish day schools as opposed to those who are not?
Okay, so we have roughly 100,000 students in Jewish day schools. About 18,000 of those are in high schools across North America.
So 100,000 out of about, if we look at the entire Jewish community in the US, we're looking at more or less about 6 million people. So it's not, it's a smaller number, but these are obviously going to be the people who are, how would you define these people who send to Jewish day school? Because these are cross denomination, right? They could be day schools that are Orthodox, yeshivas, Chabad, conservative, Salman Schechters, or community day schools.
Yes, and I'll add to that list Reform and Pluralist schools. So they really represent the broad swath of the Jewish community today, from infant through 12th grade, as we like to say in the field, from diapers to diplomas. And the folks in the schools are those who are both leaders and the general population of the Jewish community. What we know is that the graduates of Jewish day schools, like yourself, are disproportionately represented in the leadership of world Jewry today.
Mm-hmm. So before, I mean, we're gathering here because we want to talk a bit about, well, I want to talk a bit about what's happened in the post-October 7th world.
Right.
Now 8 months into this war, and the challenges that obviously they present a lot of challenges to the state of Israel, but also to world Jewry. But I'm curious, putting aside October 7th, because I am interested in this, what are the big challenges that Jewish day schools face? And you know, I was reading just a bit on your website. Affordability is a big issue, right? Tuition is a big issue, right? Because as I'm sure many of our listeners know, but maybe those who don't know, because of the separation of religion and state, the Jewish day schools do not get state funding for the most part, right? It could be for specific programming, but for the most part do not. And therefore tuition can range from Upper East Side Manhattan schools where you're paying $35,000 plus down to maybe less in other smaller communities, but still a substantial amount of money. So what are some of those challenges? Amy, I saw that you do some work on affordability, for example.
I do. Those are challenges that every community is facing. We do have, thankfully, my colleague Dan Perlin and I do a lot of work, not only at a community level, but also at the school level to help schools find the right sustainable model for affordability to be able to attract families into the school. I'm happy to share that we now have 6 communities across North America that have community affordability programs that are either funded and supported by their local foundation or federation to help really offset that cost and make a day school education possible. So it tends to be, it's becoming more and more popular. And we're thankful to be working with so many communities now and schools that are really seeing this as part of their long-term plan to ensure that they can have enrollment in the day schools moving forward.
So
Maybe I'll
please go ahead.
Maybe I'll layer onto that one of the things that we think about when we think about financial accessibility is ensuring that all of our schools have multiple tuition models so that every family who wants a Jewish day school education finds a financial model that works for their family. And that's something that we're really committed to over the long term so that we do everything that we can to reduce the barriers of entry. Maybe I'll build on that and talk about a couple of other opportunities that we see with Jewish day schools in addition to this conversation about financial accessibility. Does that sound okay, Jakob?
Please.
Okay, so a second opportunity for Jewish day schools in North America, let me take a step back. For our collective investment, really in the vibrancy of Jewish life, and even in our most difficult and challenging times that we'll lean into in a little bit in this conversation, we believe that the strength of our Jewish education will ultimately sustain North American Jewish life and contribute to world Jewry. And that is singly dependent upon the talent in our schools. So a woman named Rona Novick, who's the dean of the Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education at Yeshiva University, speaks often about what she calls growing the garden of educators. So we need to recognize that educators don't just spring up, right? But they must first have fertile soil, and we need to create the best environment for everyone in our talent pipeline to grow, and then take care in planting the seeds and nourishing the growth, certainly well before we can expect the fully grown educators. So when we think about this, I would say, career pipeline, we look at 4 core pillars here at Prisma. We talk about recruitment and training, creating the environments for success, ongoing development and learning, and investing in the career arc of the Jewish day school educator. So we pulled together the field. It was at the 2019 Prisma conference that educational guru George Couros, I don't know if you've ever interacted with George. If not, I recommend reading his work and listening to some of his podcasts. He said the smartest person in the room is the room, which is to say that when we, what's that?
I was saying meaning, yes.
Meaning, right? Together, the rising tide raises all ships. So Prisma, together with the Jewish Education Innovation Challenge, really pulled together dozens of practitioners and thought leaders and leaders in the field to create a series of 36 new ideas and some of the thinking that has the potential to advance the Jewish day school talent pipeline. And I'm happy to share that playbook and any of those resources with our listeners today. So that's a second opportunity that I can share. Yeah.
So very interesting, but I just want one more question on the affordability element of it. Maybe back to Amy on that is the lots. I know that, for example, maybe this you might not want to answer, so feel free to say I don't have what to say on this. But sure. I know I used to work for a couple of years in the diaspora affairs ministry in Israel back about 10 or so years ago. Took a break from journalism and went to see how depressing government is. And anyhow, it is depressing, by the way. But One of the things that, that's definitely the Diaspora Affairs Ministry, which is focused a bit on trying to understand what can the state of Israel do for Jews of the world Jewry, was always this kind of idea: should the state of Israel provide funding, like Birthright, for example, should it give money towards Jewish education, give a voucher, give some sort of economic incentive that would make it more affordable for regular people who aren't thinking about it at the moment, or who think about it but then say, wait, too much money, can't afford it, to maybe come and enroll their kids in Jewish day school. Is that something that you think is a good idea? There's ever an app? Because I always hear it come up and down over the years. I'm sure it's something that has definitely floated across your way.
Yes. Yeah,
So
it definitely has. I mean, I think that's a conversation that's been ongoing for a long time. And we have been in partnership with that ministry for United and Israel Education. So again, in having that partnership and support and continuous conversation, it's hard to say where that will lead, but I think that's a good first start, right? And making sure that we are supporting the Jews that live outside of Israel with Jewish educational opportunities. So we're going to have to wait and see where that takes us.
Yeah. So let's jump for a moment to October 7th, right? Which was obviously a shock to the system, definitely in Israel, but also worldwide, and explosion of anti-Semitism, as we now sadly and unfortunately have witnessed and know, and probably many of you feel. But the question is, how has this been playing out also in the education system, in the Jewish day school system? So I guess there's two pieces to this, right? There's the question of the challenge in education, which I guess would go to Deborah. And then there's the question of enrollment, which would be to Amy, but also, there's been temporary student enrollment, which I've seen, and resources on your website, interesting to read about, just for listeners and viewers, if you're interested in this topic. But Deborah, why don't you start with us on kind of the education curriculum challenges that this presented?
Sure. I would reframe and suggest that, in fact, there weren't challenges. They were tremendous opportunities for Jewish day schools to dig deep into what we do best. The schools in North America really serve as community centers and well springs of inspiration. And it's common that our school community looks to the leaders to help frame and contextualize and understand an event, especially one that's ongoing. And that's often been true for our students, for our faculty, for the families of the school. In the case of October 7th, Stephen Lorch, who is the head of school at Kadima Day School in California, described the role of the head of school as mourner-in-chief, right? Meaning the community was looking to the leaders to help us to frame and contextualize and understand. But post-October 7th, something interesting happened, which is that the circle expanded, the circle of influence expanded significantly as school leaders educated not just their own constituents, if you will, but also Jewish and non-Jewish colleagues leading independent schools and universities. So we saw a significant broadening of those concentric circles and spheres of influence. A second deepening, I would call it, more than a shift, was around schools' pre-existing investment in mental health and the well-being of our communities. Since COVID, the truth is that leaders in our schools have invested in the support networks and tools that they provide for students, family, and faculty alike for navigating difficult situations and the ebb and flow of day-to-day life. So, I'll share one piece of research around the stress contagion framework, meaning that stress is something that's contagious in the world. So based on the research, we know that faculty stress directly impacts student cortisol levels, which is intuitive and fascinating. right? That is to say that the well-being of the educators then has this harmonic vibration with the well-being of our students. So one of the ways that our schools really have counteracted this is to invest in school counselors. And we have the privilege of working with school counselors across North America and create spaces for them to learn together, to support one another, and to in turn support the well-being of their school communities. So in that second area of mental health and well-being, we've worked hard really to teach teachers about the variety of mental health issues that they might encounter inside and beyond the classroom, and use this teach the teacher model so that we can really maximize the impact that the information can have. Amy and I have a colleague named Dr. Oshra Cohen, and Oshra taught me a saying of Benjamin Franklin's. He said, when the well is dry, they know the worth of water.
Mhm.
Right? That by prioritizing and investing resources in the psychological well-being of the faculty, we're really filling up the well from which
So
our
it's this. So just to understand, we're talking about the psychological well-being of the educators, not of the students, right? That's where the stress was really being felt to a large extent.
So the stress was certainly impacting the adults in the building, no two ways about it. And the ability of the adults in the building to then navigate the conversations and to make the kinds of curricular choices that they needed to make. You know, when we think about what education, right, when you talked about the curricular decisions and inside the classroom decisions. So there was tremendous conversation around will schools continue to bring their students to Israel, right? And how do we make those decisions? So we saw phenomenal uptick in leaders turning to one another, right? The peer-to-peer support networks, which span, as you described in the beginning, the geographic, the political, the religious, the cultural spectrum of the Jewish community. Those networks really are a thread, part and parcel of Jewish day schools and yeshivas. So when we think about, for example, excuse me, the conversation around Israel education, we really saw schools grappling with this question. So I'll give you an example. Rabbi Joseph Beda is the head of school at Yeshiva Flatbush, the Joel Braverman High School. And he talked about his decision. He actually quoted Rabbi Riskin, Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, who asked the question, is Israel our Disneyland? Or he called it our motherland, right? What I would say our homeland, right? Is Israel the place you go when the sun is shining, when times are good, when prices are right? Or is it the place, right? Is it the home that you go to when the folks there need you? So Rabbi Beda created 4 different missions of over 100 students and over 50 adults to come, not just one time, but on an ongoing.
I actually met. I happened to be somewhere, and I met one of those groups that was brought by Rabbi Yigal Sklarin. That's right,
Yes.
one of the teachers at the school. Right.
Yes. You know, the dedication to not just those trips, but the conversations around Israel education really exponentially empowered what schools were able to do on the ground. Yeah.
But your feeling is, so, you know, Flatbush, is it an outlier or is it the trend? Because I could see how there could be schools maybe coming from different streams of the community,
right?
Decide to actually take a step back and say, you know what? Let's hold off for now. Let's not talk too much about Israel at the moment. Does that Are you seeing that kind of phenomenon?
So we are absolutely not seeing the phenomenon of let's not talk about Israel, right? Jewish day schools at their core are connected to the vibrancy of Israel, and our schools represent the diversity of the Jewish community, which means that we have difficult conversations about Israel. It's not all Pollyannish. The schools are leaning into those spaces and, in fact, bringing in the expertise of a variety of Israel education providers to help facilitate and navigate those conversations. And we're better for it.
Yeah. So Amy, let's talk just a bit about enrollment for a moment. So like what were some of the questions or people reaching out? There's temporary enrollment, there's enrollment for next year, because obviously we're nearing the end of the school year now in June. Where do things stand? Are you expecting an uptick? Are you expecting a decrease? And what is this temporary enrollment situation?
Sure. Yeah, no, let's break it down into two parts. I think, framing it first in the temporary enrollment space, right after the war broke out, for those families, there was a surge of families that came from Israel that were able to or had connections in the United States or in families in different communities, came to the day schools. And by the end of October,
but sorry to interrupt, but we're talking about probably families that like of evacuees, people who left their homes
across the spectrum.
All
right. So there were some definitely from all different, I'd say, coming from any space in Israel, not necessarily just the areas that were immediately impacted. But I can tell you by the end of October, we did our first initial survey because we started to hear, Deborah referenced our deep connections as a network that we have with our schools, and have regular engagements with admission professionals and heads of school and various different stakeholders in the school space. So our admission professionals came to us and said, we are seeing something really major happening here. So by the end of October, the first survey we did, which was very quick, we fielded it. We had just over 900 inquiries from Israeli families for temporary enrollment, which was outstanding. Now, families coming from Israel, and then this first surge of a wave, of course, as Deborah mentioned, all the different supports and things that teachers and staff and faculty were having to do to make it possible, not only to manage the current students and staff in place, but now a whole other group of new people, right, coming in, which had various different needs, from emotional, language. Let's just talk about the basics. And then we get into, of course,
emotional distress also, of course,
the traumatic piece of that, and then how the students are interacting and that integration. So that set off, we jumped to that to help them, to see how can we support them better, ensuring that we were available to walk them through that. But from an enrollment standpoint, by the end of December, it skyrocketed yet again. And I can tell you that we had over 2,000 inquiries and 1,000 students enrolled that were temporary students coming from Israel, which was really an outstandingly large number for our day school system to receive, to be able to process, and to help them with all of the support needs that they needed. And I think what this also signaled for us was a huge shift amongst other families in our own Jewish communities here to look at that day school. Deborah referenced that earlier, this hub that provides within the community, to give them that sense of support, to stay together. We need to be together during this really difficult time. So we started to see, then we moved to the second phase of that, which is the interest that was coming in from other students in public school, or other independent private schools that exist here in the United States. And those inquiries were really driven, I think they came in about 4 different bucket areas they identified. Definitely anti-Semitism in their own educational setting. Certainly there were Israeli families in that section as well that identified that they'll do a permanent relocation. So that is different from our temporary students, many of whom have all gone back, by the way, to Israel. But there is a small percentage that will stay. And then there's a desire too, we heard from families that they're looking for community and safety, for that learning environment to be very Jewish focused for them was much more pronounced than it had ever been before in their life or their lifestyle choice. And then the fourth and final one was, of course, around Jewish identity and education in general. Families that may not prioritize Jewish education as part of their parenting plan, we're re-examining that and how that really fit in, and identifying in a way and connecting in ways that they hadn't before. And I'm speaking mostly for families that are of the non-observant track. So definitely families looking for place to be in community with one another. So where does this go from here? What does this look like? We don't yet have the final enrollment numbers and the full impact, and won't until after the start of the school year. But our last survey did signal that 50% of the schools that participated in our survey did indicate that they saw a significant increase in inquiries from families they had never heard of before. So that for us is telling us that there could be something here, a groundswell of potential enrollment impact to the positive. But we're very hopeful that that's the case, but we won't know those definitive numbers until, of course, after the fall begins. But our schools are telling us that they're still getting inquiries from families, especially in the last 6 weeks here, where we've seen a lot of activity in our academic spaces in universities here. Those inquiries also jumped for schools as well, for families looking to put their children in a place that was comfortable and safe for their children.
So the basic, I guess, motivation, or the catalyst is anti-Semitism. Would that be?
So I would frame that differently. What I would say is that the folks coming are really looking for community and belonging. That it's not that we're running away from, it's that it's not unusual throughout Jewish history that Jews come together during hard times, right? The Jewish people in North America today are really looking for places to feel a sense of community and belonging, and Jewish day schools and yeshivas strive to ensure that each stakeholder within a school community has a sense of belonging, right? Knowing that this school, this place is somewhere where they're included, where they're respected as a human being, where they're honored with dignity. And this really culture of belonging connotes a belief that each person's divinely imbued spark deserves to be included and valued and celebrated. And Jewish day schools and yeshivas do that. And it's interesting. We know from the research of Alex Thompson that this isn't just for the students in Jewish day schools, but it's for the adult community, right? The parent and the faculty community and belonging as well.
So I want to go back, Deborah, something you mentioned before. We're talking about the Jewish educators themselves and their challenges that they've been facing, and a lot of the work that you do on a regular basis, excluding the war and this post-October 7th reality, but work that's done to identify, cultivate, and build out career tracks that people stay on. I'm just curious on that point. Is one, I know in Israel a bit about the education system, because I have 4 kids that have gone through it and are still in it, but also I have a sister.
And once you have a child that's been through it, we know that Jewish parents are experts.
Yeah, of course. I mean, one second. First of all, I'm a journalist by training, or so we're just experts on everything, even if we're not.
I love it.
That goes. But also, my sister-in-law for years, decades, has been a teacher in the Israeli school system, and one of the big problems that we have here, because of low pay, for example, a lot of turnover, and just a lot of, there's a strong union. I mean, very different challenges than what you'd face in the US, but a lot of turnover and a lot of burnout and a lot of low pay, right? Are probably some of the big challenges that you're going to face here in Israel. What are the challenges on a regular school year that you're facing with educators in the US?
So I would say in the Torah, the greatest accolade that we can give is our teacher, right? We call Moshe Rabbeinu, right? Moshe, our teacher. That cachet is not necessarily what filters out throughout the rest of the world. So as you described, the pay is not simple, right? And the ability to honor our faculty through pay is an ongoing challenge. The reality in North America today, which is not unique to Jewish day schools and not unique to independent schools, is the talent pipeline.
Mhm.
And that's a very real challenge. And the reason that Prisma really invested in the Jewish Day School Educator, what we call the Pipeline Playbook, which is this series of 36 new ideas and thinking to advance the Jewish Day School talent pipeline. The reason that we invested in that is to begin conversations in schools, in communities throughout North America, really galvanizing partnerships and inspiring funders and school and community leaders to seed new initiatives and advance that pipeline of Jewish Day School and Yeshiva talent. So those are two things that I would point to.
Well, I want to thank you both very much for this conversation. Very fascinating and interesting, at least for me, to learn more about these challenges. And I think for people across the Jewish world who care about the vitality and the strength of Jewish identity, recognize how important and vital all of this is for a strong Jewish future, and of course for a strong Israel diaspora relationship, which is just as important in my view. So to Deborah and to Amy and to Prisma, thank you very much for being with us.
Yaakov, it's been a treat. Thank you for the time and for highlighting some of the work that our 300 plus schools and leaders do.
My pleasure.
And that's it from today's episode. Thank you very much to Gil Troy, to Deborah, and to Amy, and to all our listeners and viewers. You can catch us on Thursday. We'll have a special episode with JPPI President, Professor Yedidya Stern, and longtime American veteran diplomat Ambassador Dennis Ross, discussing the view from Israel, as well as the United States, of what's happening here in the region. So be sure to catch us this coming Thursday, 6 p.m. Israel time, 11 a.m. on the East Coast.